to talk about something slightly different now. I mean, the whole presentation today in the forum has been about the risk, about the catastrophic risk. I'm going to talk about what happens when the risk becomes reality. So what happens when there's a big loss, and how do we deal with it? To introduce myself, my name is Vlad, PRYKMETA, as you can see. I work for a company called RGL Forensics. We're accountants, and we specialize in the quantification of insurance losses. We have 27 offices across the world, and we work on the, basically we get involved on the losses which happen after catastrophes. So, as an example, I'm working on one of the largest losses at the moment in UK, following the storm at Desmond, which happened last year. Also, some of my colleagues are now in the Caribbean looking at the losses at the aftermath of the Hurricane Matthew. So I'm going to focus really about the businesses and how this catastrophe is focused on business, because this is where the insurance pays out particularly big. The one way that risk of catastrophe can be mitigated is by business interruption insurance. So business interruption, in principle, what it is designed to put the insured back in the same financial position it would have been, but for the damage. So effectively, there are different policies out there. There's different business interruption policies. In principle, they say three things. First of all, they say what losses are covered. So generally, that means losses which are directly related to damage to the insured property. Secondly, for an accountant, what's most important, they say how the loss is to be calculated. And generally, the way that they word it is they talk about loss of gross profit. So if you have a company and their revenue drops because of the incident, then this is what is insured. So we use that to calculate how much gross profit is lost. Then the policies also talk about the additional costs which are incurred to mitigate the loss. And we look at the savings as well, how much company potentially has saved. So the idea with this methodology is to return the company back to where they would have been. And finally, what the insurance policy set is the rules. So they say how much is the maximum amount of loss, how much is the maximum period of indemnity, how much are deductibles, and so on and so on. So just really briefly, in practice, what does it look like when there is a loss? When you have a company and he has a business interruption loss. The first step is appointment of the experts by the insurance company. So this includes loss adjusters, accountants, engineers, potentially other industry experts, lawyers, depending on the specifics of the loss. For every loss, situation is different, but generally all the experts work as a team, and the key person really is a loss adjuster who is sort of managing the whole team. Is the one who's reporting the results to the insurers, and is a key point of contact for the insured as well. So once the experts are appointed, there's normally a site visit. From our point of view, it's very important to understand the business, understand how it was impacted by the incident. Early on, we start looking about the possible mitigation steps, because for us and for anyone really, the best kind of loss is where the majority of the loss of gross profit has been mitigated by some actions that are taken. It's not always possible, but sometimes at least proportion should be saved. So based on that, we have discussions with the insured. We request documents, so this would be production data, financial data, based on which we then prepare loss models, BI loss models, which are used to substantiate the loss. And one of the reasons, it can support payments on account, so that to help the business's cash flow if they had once they had a loss. And also those models are then used, we discuss them with the insured and with the insurers, and they're used to actually settle the loss. And then if there are opportunity, then we assist the insurers with the subrogation as well, so with the recovery of the payout. So let's have a look in more detail, with more specific look at the potential for the catastrophic risks. I think the one thing to bear in mind is that a company or a business is much more than just the property, building, machinery, and equipment. A company has staff, employees, it relies on suppliers, it has utilities, it gets utilities, water, If it manufactures something, it has a distribution network, and then hopefully it has some customers as well. The one thing about the catastrophic risks is that when something big happens, it can hit basically any of those factors. And sometimes when there's something really dramatic, it can hit all of them. In addition, you have other factors which the company or the business doesn't even have the control over. So we have general economic conditions, exchange rate, commodity prices, you have laws and regulations, you have what the competition is doing, and the general demand for the products. And a catastrophic event can also impact these factors. So let's have a look at some examples. The one example I have is let's see if this works. Yep, is the floods in Thailand, which I think is quite an extreme really example, because this is where the country has been impacted so much by the flooding that is beyond belief really. And I saw one of the charts earlier on which was showing the economic damage. I think it's one of the highest on record. So essentially what happened is that you can see now on that map, it happened in, I believe, August, September 2011. There was a lot of rain, and the country started to flood from the north, which is mainly where the agricultural areas are, and the water gradually was spreading throughout Thailand all the way down to the south, around the Bangkok area, where all the commercial areas are. And the whole process took quite a long time. The water, the flooding started, I believe, September, and it continued all the way until December. New areas were being flooded. So it was taking quite a long time. And the interesting thing is that for businesses in Thailand, having PI insurance, which was covering losses from damage to their premises, wasn't necessarily enough. And to give you an example, I've got some pictures there, but Thailand manufactured 40% of all the hard drives in the world for the computers. And some of the biggest manufacturers that got flooded. So one of the biggest one is Western Digital. You can see it underwater there. That meant that there was a shortage of hard drives in the global market. And if you are assembling computers and selling computers, that meant that you had losses because of the damage to your supplier. So you might have been located not even in Thailand, and you still would have had the losses. Also, you might have been, if you are a manufacturer of semiconductors, which there's a few in the area, and you are supplying to one of the electronics companies, which is down the road and got flooded, you couldn't sell your products because your customer got flooded and this is unable to buy them from you. In addition, of course, you have the situation such as all the roads were flooded in the area, there was no power, there was no water. So the good news is that it's possible to get extensions for the business interruption, for the customers, for the damage at customers' premises, suppliers' premises, for denial of access, and for utilities. But this costs extra, and there's often sublimits included as well when it comes to that. And actually, when we were dealing, this insurance extensions, generally the losses stemming from damage somebody else's premises, they're referred to as contingent business interruption, or CBI. And the majority of losses we've dealt with in Thailand were actually this CBI losses. So moving along, you also have to bear in mind that in a situation like in Thailand, sometimes even the best possible policy in the world is not going to cover all the losses. And the reason for that, like as it was the case in Thailand, the heavily flooded areas, there was actually an exodus of people. So that meant that businesses they lost their staff, there was no one to work, but critically they lost their customers as well. So there was no demand for certain products. And this brings us on to the concept of a wide area damage. Essentially what this talks about, this concept has been popular since, I believe, 2005, when following the Hurricane Katrina. There was a case there after flooding in New Orleans. And essentially this concept arises from the but-for principle, which is, in essence, what it says is that the policy promises, I'm going to read this, promises to return the company to the position that would have been but for the damage. So effectively this invites us to imagine that if you have a flooded business, what would have So what would have happened if somehow miraculously it escaped the water and there was no physical damage? So you have something like that in the picture here. So if you imagine this is a business in the flooded area and somehow they escaped it, you can almost see from the picture that there's a good chance they wouldn't be able to continue to trade in a normal way in any event. You know, there's no roads, there's probably interruptions with power and water. There's potentially the fact that the customers are not going to be there. So if you imagine that this is a hotel, for example, a luxury hotel or a spa, there's a good chance that there's going to be a reduction in trade because the whole area is flooded. And so as I mentioned, this actually came to prominence after flooding of the hotel in New Orleans, which submitted a claim for business interruption. But what was found is that the fact that the city was evacuated, and even if it didn't get flooded, there still wouldn't have been tourists or the people to stay in the hotel. So the insurance payout was actually less than the claim, which was based on their normal trading levels. And as you can see, this is quite a controversial concept, really, because, I mean, you might feel a bit hard done if you buy insurance against flood, and then the insurance company turns around and say you have no loss because everybody else around you got flooded as well. On the other hand as well, it can actually result in a windfall in the profits for the company insured. So if you imagine that this business here on the picture is actually a shop supplying building materials and it somehow managed to survive the flooding and is operating, then there's probably going to be quite good trade for this business. So they might be better off. So they have the insurance payout potentially is going to be bigger than what they normally make. So because of this, because this concept is quite controversial, I mean, what we've seen in experience is that some insurers choose almost to ignore it. We've seen it in the north of England, the floods, where the insurers as a group, they decided they're not going to apply this principle. One of the reasons was media, because if you start telling people they don't have any loss when they're clearly underwater, then this is not a very good news story. So essentially they use the normal benchmarking, looking at the previous years and so on to calculate the loss. Okay, just a couple other factors. This is sort of the other factors which we find are important when it comes to catastrophic risks. So something to bear in mind. So one of them is the length of the indemnity period. A lot of insurance policies, they have indemnity period of 12 months. Often when it comes to natural catastrophes, 12 months is no long enough. If you stay underwater for a significant period of time, then you need time to rebuild the premises before you can come back to full operation. Often what happens is when you have a localized damage, is that there's a shortage of contractors and suppliers and materials for your rebuilding, and also the cost can go up. So this is adding to the losses, and it's also adding to the time it takes to restore, which extends the business interruption losses. This is quite common, but you need to ensure that the business is adequately insured, so there's no average being applied. Also, when people insure gross profit, they normally choose to uninsure some costs. So, for example, cost of your raw materials, because you might reasonably assume that if your business is not working, you're not spending any more money on the raw materials because you don't need to buy them. But you just need to be careful that the costs that you think are variable, they're truly variable. So, for example, if you buy materials on a take-or-pay contract, say that you're a food manufacturer and you buy the harvest of potatoes because you make chips, your costs, the cost of potatoes is not actually variable. You might still have the obligation to buy those potatoes. And the economics of mitigation cost. Generally, BI policies, they cover, well, I think all the ones I've seen, they cover additional costs to mitigate the loss. But they say that this costs have to be economic. So that means that you can spend €1 if you're going to save €1, but not more than that. When it comes to the catastrophes, often companies have to spend quite a lot more than usual to mitigate the loss. So potentially, there's potential for uneconomic additional costs. And there's actually a cover available for that as well. So you can get additional increase in cost of working. Okay, so at this stage you're probably thinking like, well, this is all very negative, and I'm talking about all the problems I think which can come up. Well, good news is that business interruption does work, and I have an example that I'm going to talk about. This happened in Thailand, and this is where the whole process just worked really well, and the company had BI insurance, and it's really a success story, I think, for the industry. So what we're talking about is the Tesco Lotus supermarket group. It's actually UK owned, and it's the second largest chain of supermarkets in Thailand. They got flooded. About 10% of their shops were flooded, and critically, all of their distribution centers got flooded. So without distribution centers, it's very difficult to operate all the other shops. So that meant that all of their shops were impacted one way or the other. They also lost suppliers, so the local farms supplying food could not supply, and in some areas, the customers were moving around as well. So that was an issue. Now, the company's priority was really, they've taken it as a mission to restore the business as much as possible, and this is management and everyone really working for this company. They really focused on their customers because they realized that for a lot of people living in a flooded area, they were one of the few places where people could still get products. So they opened up a lot of the stores while they were still flooded. And I think this picture is actually people going to the store while they're still underwater. So often what happened, the ground floor would have all the small shops, and then the supermarket would be on the top floor. So actually the top floors were still open and they were dry. So the company also provided some accommodation for their for their staff. So people whose houses got flooded, they actually provided them with a place to stay. And the other good thing that worked is the fact that Tesco had a really wide policy. I mean, they had all the extensions I talked about. They had a supply extension, they had denial of access extension, they even had a customer extension. So technically, they actually insured the losses they might have if their customer, Mr. Smith down the road had a flood. So actually, so effectively what they've done by getting all those extensions is to make sure that this concept of wide area damage would not apply to them, that they would be insured on every front. And I think the adjustment went really well as well, even though I say so myself, I was involved in this claim. There were regular visits by the loss adjuster and us, the accountants. We were constantly in discussions with the client. We collected the data, which meant that we could do payments on accounts really quickly to give them the money to spend to return to normal. There were people traveling, local adjusters from shop to shop, assessing the damage, almost paying straight away. And the claim was settled somewhere like within 6 to 8 months of the flood starting. So I think when they were settled, some of the places were still not fully open, with there's still some damage going. And this was recognized in the British Insurance Awards in 2013. This was selected as a major loss award just because it went so well. Okay, so with this, it just remains me to thank you for your attention.